Yes, I agree. There is a mic if you want it. I don't know if you do or not. But
See, I can try without.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. But follow the I understand. And just, yes. So I'm gonna get out of the way. Oh. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's the one that's already recorded. How are you? Wonderful. And I'll visit with you afterwards. I got a panic call from Steve yesterday because he's having trouble getting sponsorships. Jen Beck's gonna call some people today, but I have a list I was gonna send out to you and Chuck and maybe Jen and Brock. I don't know. Well, that's what I thought. I knew you guys were gone. Yeah. It's the continuous swirling. And we're doing stuff for National Library. So a variety of things there. And then next week is our 10th anniversary of this building. So with more things. Of the remodel.
Well, yeah, I know that, but I mean, 10 years.
I know.
I guess I thought it was long.
I just want us to be quiet.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm Dr. Nathan Ty. I'm the Assistant Professor of Nebraska History here at UNK, and it is my great honor to have Dr. Catherine Biba from Hastings College sharing with us her research on atomic spinsters. But just a couple of announcements before we begin. I want to again thank the Kearney Public Library for co-sponsoring the Brown Bag Lecture Series held every month on the second Wednesday. And I wanted to make you aware of upcoming events as part of the series and an extension of the series. We actually have 2 more events coming up this month. Wednesday, April 13th, Dr. Pradeep Barua is going to be giving a book talk on his new book at 7 p.m. in this room, The Late Colonial Indian Army from the Afghan Wars to the Second World War. The following week, on April 20th, also at 7 p.m. and a Wednesday, Dr. Jim Rohr is going to be giving a talk on his new book, The Early Life of George Leslie Mackay, the Prophet of Formosa. He was a Presbyterian minister and missionary in Taiwan in the late 19th century. And then on May 4th, at noon, Dr. William Stoudemire, the public historian at the University of Nebraska-Kearney, is going to be giving a lecture, Whose Heritage, Archaeology, Looting, and the Museum of Northern Arizona. So we're very excited for that. For a schedule of upcoming events and other history department events, please see our website and our social media, Twitter, Facebook, and the like. But today, our speaker is Dr. Catherine Biba. Dr. Biba is an assistant professor of history at Hastings College. There she teaches all manner of courses in U.S. history, from the American West to college sports in America, and from natural disasters in the United States to the history of the American family. A native of Geneva, Nebraska, she earned her BA in history and English from UNL before earning her MA and Ph.D. in history from Cornell University, where she wrote a very wonderful dissertation on the Easter tornado of Omaha of May 1913. In addition to teaching in the classroom, Dr. Biba loves having the opportunity to speak to the public about American history and has spoken at the Nebraska Chautauqua First Presbyterian Church in Hastings and Hastings Museum's Spirits and Interesting People event. When she's not doing history, she enjoys stories that didn't actually happen, i.e. reading fiction, sewing quilts and clothing, traveling extensively, and watching the Great British Bake Off pretty much on permanent loop. If you have any questions, please save them for the end, but now, Atomic Spinsters.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay?
I feel like one of the benefits, the unsung benefits of COVID was that I've taught in a mask now for the better part of 2 years. And I think that it's made me a louder person. So that's, I guess, not worth it overall, but one good thing that we've gotten from that. So thanks so much for having me here. Speaking of COVID, I think that this has been in the works for about 2 years. I think I was originally scheduled to come here in 2020, which of course did not happen. So thank you for remembering that you wanted to have me come talk and asking me back. So I'm really looking forward to this. So as Nathan told you, this is not at all what I studied in grad school. My grad school project has to do with 1913, so not mid-century. Has to do with the tornado, which we are also not going to be talking about today. And it's interesting stuff, but somewhere along the way, a very different area of research caught my attention. And I think that it was the combination of a few factors that led me to develop this interest in quote unquote atomic spinsters, I guess. First, I inherited a class, as sometimes you do when you go to an institution. And that class that I've really come to love teaching, it's actually 2 classes. It's U.S. history through the lens of women's history. So women in the U.S. To 1890 and women in the U.S. since 1890. Even for somebody who has a pretty decent grip on U.S. history, like me, right? Studied it for a long, long time. Teaching these courses specifically from the viewpoint of women's history makes me ask different questions. Every time I teach it, I'm like, wow, I never thought of that before. And that's, of course, the point of courses like that, right? That's why we teach those sorts of things. So the experiences of women, thinking about those in new and different ways, was something that I've been kind of considering over the past few years. The other influence that led me to this topic is more personal. I'm an unmarried woman and I'm not 23 years old. So living much of my 20s and 30s unmarried, while much of my peer group, especially here in Nebraska, married and had children, made me think about what life might have been like for men and women who remained single in the past, whether that was through choice or whether that was through circumstance. It's not so terrible to be a single woman in 2022. I have my own house, I have a Ph.D, my own credit, sometimes a date, the requisite cats, the whole thing. So I'm not an old maid like living in my mother's attic or anything like that. It's not the worst thing. So, but many of these things, except for the cats, right, have not always been open to women in particular who have chosen or have found themselves unmarried. So what was it like, I wondered, to not be married when the overwhelming societal norm and expectation was to be married, and when the experience of singleness was perhaps far more constraining or stressful than it is in 2022? Well, that brings us to mid-century marriage mania. I never met an alliteration that I didn't like, so that's where you get that. But the 1950s, and that's what we're primarily going to be focusing on today, is a moment where we are seeing in the United States just a really big fixation on marriage, settling down, having families, what we kind of all together would call domesticity, right? And the 1950s are a big moment for that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. So ironically, although we're talking about spinsters, we're actually going to spend a little bit of time talking about marriage as well, because that's going to be what we're defining many of these women in contrast to, and why this fixation or kind of obsession with marriage emerges at this particular moment. Then we're going to spend the second part of this talk taking a look at how these messages are given out to women, in particular in this time period. I am going to focus primarily on single women. I've done a little bit of looking at single men. I don't know as much about it, so that's part of the reason that I haven't included it in this. Also, you got to draw the line somewhere. But if you have a question at the end, go ahead and throw it out, and I'll see what I can do as far as answering it, because it's an interest area of mine as well. So, if you came for the bachelor talk, sorry, that's not going to be as much of what we're doing today, but that's okay. All right. So are atomic spinsters, which, by the way, is a phrase I made up. This isn't actually what they were called. Spinster is. Spinster is a really common term from this time period. Atomic spinster is not, just kind of a reference to the nuclear obsessions and preoccupations of the 1950s. This is kind of emblematic in some ways. This quotation comes from a special issue of Life magazine that appeared on December 24th. Merry Christmas, everyone, right? It's a special issue called The American Woman, Her Achievements and Troubles. And every article in this issue of Life magazine is focused on a different facet of what it means to be a woman in the United States in this time period. And it's actually a very interesting document. You can access this, by the way. There's many decades of Life magazine that are digitized through Google Books. So if you Google Life magazine digitized, you can actually go ahead and look up this entire issue if you are so curious after the end of this here. But one of the takes from this is that the American woman is perhaps not doing so well. Some of the authors and contributors feel that. And coming in for special criticism by one of the authors is the single career woman. The single career woman, that great mistake that feminism propagated, may find satisfaction in her job, but the chances are that she will suffer psychological damage. Should she marry and reproduce, her husband and children will be profoundly unhappy. All right. So, how would we characterize from this quote the vibe towards spinsters and unmarried women at this point in time? Not great, right? This is a little bit misleading because on the very cover of this special woman's issue, there is a picture of a woman and her child, and it is titled The Working Mother. So that introduces us a little bit to the ambiguity of how people are feeling about this. But the fact that this very, very strong statement exists at this time is evidence that, we haven't quite embraced the idea of a woman finding fulfillment in a career rather than her work. Okay, so let's take a look here at what comes to be known as the Back to the Home movement. All right. It's a little bit of an outdated meme. If you don't understand it, that's okay. My students really like this one, so that's okay. In the 1940s, as you probably know, there are a lot of women who are involved in the workforce. Most famously, this comes to be signified by a largely fictional character called Rosie the Riveter, right? Women working in the defense industries, the very famous, We Can Do It poster that you've all seen. That is defined during wartime as what women should be doing. There's a concerted effort by the US government that women shouldn't be able to go to a movie, get on a bus, go to a bank without seeing that the thing they should be doing is war work. So the definition, the duty that women are expected to uphold in the early 1940s is that they should be contributing to the war effort somehow, including by working outside of their homes. So you see this kind of move away from the homemaker role and one where there's kind of this societal embrace of women working in outside the home and even in traditionally masculine jobs. This is a less well-known depiction of Rosie the Riveter. This one's by Norman Rockwell. You probably recognize the style there. But she is depicted in a really kind of masculine way. She's not done up particularly fancy, right? This is not like the Marilyn Monroe version of Rosie the Riveter. She looks like she's getting sweaty and dirty and doing tough stuff. Okay? And that's okay in the early 1940s. But as we move away from World War II, almost as quickly as that idea got put forth, an opposite idea emerges. And that idea is that women need to leave these jobs. These jobs belong to soldiers, returning soldiers. And so women need to go back into their homes. That's what they should be doing, okay? And so we get almost this whiplash. I always kind of think that it must have been a really interesting time for for women and to live through the 1940s and just hear these extremely different messages that are put forward to them as they're trying to figure out what they're doing in their lives. Now, to be fair, there are plenty of women who are ready and happy to leave these jobs behind, right? They maybe didn't necessarily find a lot of joy in doing them, and they're okay with that move, right? They've perhaps deferred marriage and having children, and they're okay with making that switch. But there's lots of other women who are feeling a little bit put out by that messaging, right? They've had the opportunity to earn more money than most feminine occupations have offered prior to this point. Some of them have to work, right? A lot of this messaging of women, you need to go and be homemakers, is really predicated on a certain kind of income level. That's certainly not the experience that every family is having. And so women who maybe have an economic necessity to work are saying, like, this is very unfair that we're being pushed out of these great jobs when my family actually needs this support. Okay, so nevertheless, in spite of that opposition, we get to see a re-emphasis on the family and on the home. Togetherness is the idea that kind of is labeled here. The idea that you should be spending time together with your spouse, with your children, maybe many children, if you're doing things right here. Your home is the place where you're finding fulfillment and meaning and purpose. Okay. 1953, Look magazine. Okay, we have again kind of this emphasis on how important the idea of homemaking and domesticity have become in the United States. Not since the age of Victoria has the idea of the happy home compelled such overt sentiment and general admiration. Advertisements with their happy parents and rosy children in a setting of creature comforts and domestic bliss, the magazine covers with their warm scenes of family life, testify to the expectations with which men and women enter the blessed state. Blessed state. All right. Okay. And in fact, numbers are going to bear this out as well. We are going to see a pretty large uptick in marriage rates during this time period. This is the overall graph. I put the whole thing up here, not because it's relevant necessarily to this talk, but because it's interesting. Like to see that, right? People like to see that. So you can see there's a general upward trajectory. The blue line is the rate of marriage in the United States. The orange line is the rate of divorce in the United States during this same time period, which is long, 1860 all the way up to 2010, what these numbers are recording. Okay, you can see actually that there's quite a bit of instability in the 1930s up through the 1950s. Those lines are doing all kinds of things. I'll treat you like my students here for a minute. What might be affecting the marriage rates, making it go up and down so crazily during those decades? What are some of the factors that might be doing that?
Dirty 30s.
Yes, the Great Depression. That is going to be a big part of this. Is that going to drive up marriage rates or decrease them? Decrease? Yeah, I'm seeing some no's and thumbs down. Exactly. There's actually going to be a slowing of marriages in the 1930s. Again, people are having a harder time feeling like they can support a family or even a spouse, and so that's going to drive marriage rates down. Okay, what else in the 1930s through the 1950s might be affecting the rate of marriage here?
World War II.
World War II, yeah. Do we think World War II is going to drive the marriage rate up or down?
Probably up.
Okay, I actually saw some mixed reviews on that one. Okay, what do we think? What those of you who said down, why do we think down? Anyone want to share why they think it might drive it down?
Future.
Okay, yeah, so right, yeah, it's a scary time to be alive. You don't know what's going to happen. Okay, why might it drive it up?
People decided there wasn't time to wait.
Yeah. So what we see is we actually see a pretty big spike in 1940, and actually I've cut out just a little bit here, so it's a little easier to separate here. This is from about 1940 through 1960 is what this slice is looking at. So we do see in the first years of the war actually a spike. In spite of that uncertainty, there are lots of people deciding like, well, we better do this now. And it kind of tapers off as the war progresses. And then there's another big spike in the post-war years. Okay. Interestingly, we also see what else spikes. Sometimes those quick marriages are not a great idea, it turns out. Marrying a guy you met at a dance and marrying him 2 weeks later before he ships out, sometimes it works, a lot of times it does not. So we see actually some very interesting things happening with the marriage rates there too. Okay. The next chart I want to show you, and I promise I am not going to do like lots of numbers and charts. That's not my thing. But there are a few that are very, very enlightening here for us. We're also going to see some other changes, again, in this 1930s through 1950s and 60s time period. This is referring to average marriage age for first marriage. Okay, so we're not counting anybody who is getting remarried in this data. This is the age in which people, in Americans, men, the blue line, women, the red line, are getting married for the first time. This is really surprising to my students because they kind of assume that in the 19th century, like women were getting married at age 15. And it's like, that happens, but that's actually not the norm. It's a pretty high age rate actually here when we start this in 1890. It's, an age that they themselves are like, okay, that actually is not a weird age to get married, 23, 24, and then for men a couple of years later, okay? We see a slight rise here from 1930 to 1940. Again, it's that depression effect that's changing people's ability to get married. But then 1940 to 1950, just a dramatic drop in the age of first marriage. For women, you can see that in 1950, it is over 20 or just over 20. In fact, in the early 1950s, like 51 and 52, it drops below 20 for a while. So those are averages by decade. So it doesn't show you that, but it goes even lower than that in the early 1950s. So again, remember, that's average age of first marriage. So the trend is for people to be getting married incredibly young, incredibly early. Okay, so the 1950s. Why is everybody in such a hurry to get married? Anyone know of any reasons that this might have been possible or desirable?
Well, the World War II is over and relatively safety, security.
Yeah, it's important to remember. So not just the war, but like the decade of depression before that. That's actually like 15 years of hard times, right? A decade and a half of things being really up in the air and kind of tumultuous, and people feeling maybe not as secure in their futures. And finally, it seems like maybe it's time for, like we're the only ones with an atomic bomb. We've defeated Hitler, and maybe life is going to be kind of good, right? I can give my kids, if I'm in 1950, I can give my kids something that I didn't necessarily have growing up in the 1930s, right? This prosperity and peaceful childhood that they didn't necessarily have, right? So that is really a desire for a lot of people. Any other reasons?
That job security, all of a sudden people could find work and
yeah. Economically, this is a great time for the United States. There's lots of jobs available. There's kind of a dip right after the war as we work that out, who's doing the jobs and moving to peacetime industries for more industries. But sure, it does not take terribly long for the U.S. economy to kind of get sorted back out. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s, there are a lot of jobs. Jobs tend to pay and match the cost of living relatively well, better than they do today. Just throw that out there, right? So there's this ability for people to, even from a very young age, feel like they can support a spouse and a child. Okay? Yeah, so a lot of other things that I would probably throw in here too. The GI Bill is going to be a part of this. That enables men to take advantage of college education, to have low mortgage rates on houses and things. Those, of course, are things that are going to contribute to people feeling like they have a secure future and they have, the ability to, again, raise a family. Okay, so we see these moves to suburban tract living and these kind of what today I guess are considered starter homes, right? The 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house where you can, even as a young person, theoretically afford this and be able to start your family in a home like that. Okay. All right, so that's the dream. And we also see that this is getting pushed from various places in society. So let's now turn our attention a little bit and see who is kind of helping with this messaging. And I won't say that any of these are the only way that these messages are getting out or being absorbed. These are kind of the most fun ones. So that's what's gone into this. So what we'll find from looking at some of these is that the messaging is targeted toward, in particular, teenage girls. So it's maybe not surprising that we're seeing people get married so young when you look at some of the messages that young girls in particular are starting to get. So the first thing I want to tell you a little bit about is something called romance comics. Okay, so this is a great era for comic books. The 1930s, actually, right? Like 40s, 50s. This is a huge popular genre. Well, someone gets the bright idea, we could make even more money if we sold these to girls too. But girls don't want to read about superheroes. Girls want to read about getting married. So there's this whole genre that springs up where you get young romance stories about being married. I mean, that doesn't sound like there's a lot to it, and there's actually not. But there's tons and tons of them. Often the stories kind of follow specific tropes. Westerns are really popular. So the cowgirl and she meets the farmhand with a heart of gold type of story, like those exist. But there's either the happily ever after, or sometimes there's the cautionary tale, right? Where she dates somebody who is not suitable for whatever reason and learns to regret her choice and maybe be more careful next time around. Okay. But there's a lot of happy endings here in these particular stories. They're also kind of promulgating again these specific norms of what you're supposed to kind of expect, right? In these. The other great thing that these feature are love quizzes. And so one of the things I do with my students, I have a 2-week, just kind of a special short course on single in America. And one of their assignments is to do create their own love quizzes. They have to do 1950s and then take that same topic and decide how it would be done in 2022, right? So what questions and values have changed regarding that topic. But they think these are wild. They're like, are you kidding me? I'm like, yeah, I'm not kidding you. They're in there. So things where you would go through, and they, we all laugh at them and they're funny, but I remember these from teen magazines when I was a girl too, like that these still sort of exist of, does your crush like you, if it's mostly bees, you're in the clear, right? Or whatever. So they do have a history, but they are very matrimonial in intent to an extent that I think is not the case any longer. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and I'll pass this book around if you're kind of interested in this. Don't mind all my flags. I've marked some in here, but I'll just let you, if you want to see some more of what these love comics or romance comics look like, I'll send that one around for you. Okay. So there's lots of messaging in, I guess, what we could consider popular culture for women to think about getting married. Okay? This is your job. This is your goal. Yeah. So take a look at this quiz here, right? Do your plans for the future definitely include marriage? Yes or no, right? That's the question that women are being asked. So perhaps it's no surprise that we wind up with the average, with 19-year-old women getting married in large numbers in the 1950s. Okay. Now, what happens is it turns out, bear with me, teenagers sometimes don't make great choices. I know, spoiler alert, right? And that is true even when they're getting married. And so there's a very interesting kind of course correction that happens, or I should say attempted course correction that happens, where you see educators, parents, older generations trying to be like, okay, we don't want you to be anti-marriage, but like also it's not a bad thing if you wait till you're 21 rather than 18 or 19. So looking at some of these, we're going to take a look at some of the pushback here on early marriage. Okay, so this is a letter that was written to Betty Friedan, who wrote the Feminine Mystique very famously in the 1960s. And this woman was writing to her about her experiences in the 1950s of being sort of a marriage skeptic. All right, as she and her friend were kind of like, why is everybody getting married right now? And the experience with that. So we were characterized as bitter, unromantic old witches in an affectionate kind of way because we were anti-early marriage. We're both quite satisfactorily married. It's only in recent years that I've had to go through the ridiculous business of explaining that I love my family, that they come first, even though I've always worked at some other kind of job. We did try to explain that we weren't unromantic. That was the funniest part, because our whole objective to this all-exclusive domesticity on the campus was that it was unromantic. Settling down, boy and girl in the library, making out lists of toasters, washing machines, towels. It seemed to us about the most unromantic thing that we could think of, but we never got it across and settled for being witches. So they were unpersuaded in their quest to sort of get their friends to slow their rolls. Life magazine, once again, so one you can take a look at this one if you want. It's online. Had a special feature, 1959. So we've seen a decade of this young marriage playing out. And Life magazine is going to tell us all about the dark side here of this. And for this particular article, they focused on one school that had experienced what they called a marriage boom, right? That this kind of became the trendy thing to do. Get married, don't tell your parents, even though you're like a sophomore or junior in high school. And so they're going to go back and visit some of these couples a few years after this marriage boom and see how they have fared. So it's a really interesting article. They have some where the couples seem to be doing all right and some where they do not. Okay, of course, they're going to end on the regretful note here. Garreau, which is a really interesting name. I think that's how you'd say it. But he's still in school. He got married. They had a kid right away. She eventually left him and moved back in with her mother, I believe. Garreau, he's still in school. He has never settled down. He comes to see his wife and son occasionally, but his main joy is drag racing. I'm a party boy, he explains. I just ain't cut out to be married. He's like 18 or 19, right, when this article is written here. Okay. So his wife here, who has dropped out of school because they had had a child pretty much right away, she is a little bit more optimistic. She thinks if he moved away from his hot rodding friends, that they might have a shot. But she is overall negative about her experience. I was Miss Know-It-All of Central High. I'd never do it again. So she is, she's very sad about how this has happened. The ways in which they tried to curb this problem at the high school were discussed at some length. And it was very interesting. Like, one of the big punishments was that girls groups in particular would kick out married girls from their club as kind of a punishment. Like, well, I guess you don't have time, like you're ironing your husband's clothes, you don't have time to come be part of the pep squad anymore anyway. And so that was one of the social punishments that was inflicted And the principal saw this as a good thing, right? He's saying like costing these students their kind of opportunities and social lives is one way to make this less attractive. So in this case, we see a school really like strongly pushing back against that. Another fascinating kind of corner of the internet, I guess you could say, is the old instructional films from this era. And, okay, rebooting there for no reason. These are available on YouTube. You can look at a lot of these older instructional films. If you've had experience, by the way, watching one of these, I would love to hear about it because I've not talked to somebody who watched one of these in class, and I would be very interested in hearing how that went over and how it was received. But these films are, I think they're put out by textbook publishers. You can see the one over there on the right, it's McGraw-Hill, which is a well-known textbook company. And so they're used in some kind of marriage preparedness class, health class. Like I don't fully know like what kind of class they're being taught in. So again, if you've had experience with this, I'd love to know in what venue these are being sent. I'm going to show just a couple minutes of this one. Are You Ready for Marriage? From 1950. So this one's actually a little bit early on the uptake, but.
Good night, darling. I didn't know her getting married.
Poor Larry. He has made a decision, I think is the implication.
So I asked her last night at a graduation prom, and she said yes, we were going to be married in August. Wow, married. She's just finishing high school. You still have 2 years at university. That's a tough road, Larry. What are you going to use for money? Well,
Two folks were going to pay something to put her in junior college here in town for 2 years. So we'll have that. But instead of going to college, she'll get a full-time job in campus town. And she doesn't care anymore about education. So with that, and my part-time job, we'll get by.
uh-oh, here's your now. You two probably want to be alone. What is so, honey?
Oh, Larry, what's the matter? It's the folks say we had a terrible scene. I couldn't think a wink. They don't approve. They say I'm too young. They want me to finish 2 more years of schooling before I even get engaged. Oh, Larry.
Oh, buck up, sweetheart. They can't stop me. Relax. And act normal till after your graduation next week. Then I can borrow Phil's car. Not the Greenville. There's a justice of the peace down there. Put it low, honey.
But Larry, I wanted a church wedding. And all the parties and showers for me, too. And my folks, that would break Mom's heart.
Well, we're the one.
All right, so you get the idea. Very funny. What happens is they agree at the suggestion of somebody's parents. I don't know, I can't remember whose, probably Sue's. We want her to go to college, to go discuss with a minister, the costs of getting married early. And he uses some really great visual aids to kind of walk through, like, you're young, you're still developing, you're still learning who you are, and maybe, be engaged for a couple of years, Sue go to school, and you'll both then have a better idea of whether or not you want to be married. It's very interesting. My students watch this and they're like, haha, this is really corny and outdated. And the minister is like very serious and whatever, but they're like, he's actually not wrong. And I'm like, yeah, I know. It's actually not terrible advice in this particular video. That doesn't, hold true necessarily for all of the videos from this era. But he's not wrong about advising them to, kind of wait and see how they develop and make sure their financial future is maybe a little bit more in hand before they rush out and get married. So since it's an instructional film, they see the light and they agree to wait for a couple of years before they get married. So well done, Larry and Sue. Okay. Sorry, that's not gonna work because I think they want to play it. All right. Okay. So the genie of early marriage does go back in the bottle a little bit. I don't know that it's necessarily from these concerted efforts to have people rethink marriage so quickly, or if it's just kind of run its course and other people are like, oh, okay, it's not all it's cracked up to be, right? There's probably lots of reasons that we do see the age of marriage then start to rise as we move toward the 1960s. So in the 1950s, although there's lots of cautioning against young marriage, it's still overall a very pro-marriage sort of environment. And so the depiction of unmarried women comes to look a little bit freakish, right? So we're almost back to that quote at the beginning. This is from, again, another Life magazine article that features 7 spinster sisters who live together with their father, who sounds really weird, like he dines alone, he doesn't eat with them, and then they all eat together. And I'm like, there's like weird stuff going on here. I don't know. They go camping in iron beds, like somebody carries out iron beds, and that's camping. I'm like, I don't know what is going on with this family, but it is weird. Anyway, so these 7 spinster sisters are again depicted as kind of an oddity, and this is an outsized example, right, of the fascination or sort of sense that this isn't normal behavior, but again shows the flip side of this, where we're suspicious a little bit of women who are unmarried. There are lots of advice books for women at this point in time about how they should go about finding a husband or dealing with the fact that they are single. An interesting point of this particular book, which is called How to Be Happy While Single. It's very cute. That's the original cover. I wish I had one with the original cover, but I have a reprint. It's written in 1949, so just before the 1950s here. The interesting thing is that this review of the book that appeared in the Washington, D.C. Evening Star actually really misinterprets what this book is about. Jean Van Evera, the author, tells how to win a husband. Well, that's actually not what she's telling. She's telling women how to be happy and satisfied when they're single, which is a different sort of thing. So I think that's kind of telling, right? That how to be happy while single is to stop being single and find a husband, really is sort of the assumption that this reviewer is making, which is, again, not quite what Van Evera herself is arguing for. In fact, Van Evera has a pretty positive view of the state of being single, which is a little bit at odds, I would say, with the broader society at that time. So she is funny, actually. She covers how to deal with people asking rude questions about why you're still single. And so you could be rude back, like ask them, well, how does it happen that you're married, right? Like, well, you're married. You could be mysterious, start mumbling about insanity, hopeless, and nobody will know if you mean you or him, but she says nobody's going to ask you anything further after that. Or you could just bore them to death, make up some long meandering sort of thing, make them sorry they asked. So she does have a good sense of humor about all of this. She also tackles practicalities, right? You're a single gal, you're working, you're maybe waiting to see if you're going to get married or not. And so she shares with her readers the widespread horror of shared and substandard living conditions. If you're a single woman, you are, sorry to tell you, not going to be able to buy your own house and move out to the suburbs. That's not going to be a thing that's open to you. So you're going to need to probably get an apartment or some kind of shared living situation. So she says, magazines are full of inspiring stories entitled, How I Brightened Up an Old Jail Cell with 3 yards of chintz and an orange crate. So there you go. Other advice that she gives emphasizes making a life in one's new apartment. So getting to know the neighborhood, your shopkeepers, and things like this. But she does have one caution. Nothing new remains to be said about the pleasure and companionship of a dog. Right? But a word of caution to single women should not be taken amiss. Your married friends may go crazy over spaniels, Scotties, Dobermans, or Dachshunds. Talk by baby talk and make sweaters without raising any other reaction than sympathetic smiles. But if a single woman waxes too lyrical over her pup, people become darkly analytical and remark that poor Pamela is expending all her thwarted motherhood on that dog. All right. So she's like I said, handling this with a bit of humor and things like this. She's actually a little bit cynical even toward the institution of marriage. She says there are 2 sound reasons why a woman values marriage. For one thing, it makes her children legitimate. And for the other, she feels that her tombstone will look more impressive than if she had remained single. So, all right. Funny side note, Jeannie Van Everett actually does get married later in life to a guy who's like a VP at like Bell Telephone or something. So her tombstone is not just impressive, she's buried in like an actual mausoleum like situation. So, so she did eventually wind up practicing what she preached really to the end there. And in spite of all her jocularity and I believe sincere advice to women to enjoy the state of singleness, she still assumes that marriage is the goal. The final chapter of her book is called When You Marry. So even while you're happy while you're single, the assumption is still that you are going to one day marry, that's your goal and your most likely outcome. And indeed, statistically, it was the most likely outcome. Okay. So that's one 1950s sort of thing. Again, late 1940s, I guess. That's a little bit more positive toward the state of singleness. However, as you can probably guess, that's not going to be the case for everyone. And so here's a flip side from 1952. This book is called The Single Woman, and it is written by a man named John Lawrence. He begins the book with this great line. This is a book about women written by a man who seriously believes that he understands women. Okay. All right, John. So John has told us this. Then he tells us why he understands women so well. Don't worry, he's not a gigolo nor a psychiatrist. Those are his reasons that he thinks he could be. But he is, in fact, a Catholic priest. Okay, so that's why he knows a lot about women, according to him. So if you know even a little bit about Catholic teaching, it's not going to surprise you that Lawrence believes matrimony is the best future for nearly every person in the world, except for, right? But he also believes that, if a woman has honest motives for not marrying, she should pursue a lifestyle of quote unquote complete virginity. Okay, so this is a kind of recurring motif here. Is his assumption that women are going to be not sexually active if they are unmarried. And in fact, he chooses to use the term from the first chapter on, instead of using the term spinster, so I guess good, he's not using that, but he substitutes it with reluctant virgin, which I don't think is better. His phraseology for a lot of his chapter titles starts to sound like kind of sitcom episodes maybe, or like world's weirdest comic books. So one is called The Reluctant Virgin is Advised How She Should Cope with the Embarrassment of Celibacy. The The frustrations of celibacy are real but manageable. The reluctant virgin should know what they are and what can be done about them. Or, finally, another one, puzzled by the problems men create for her, the reluctant virgin sometimes runs away. She should not. Okay, so a very different sort of flavor of advice that we're getting here from Father John Lawrence is that, that women really should be pursuing marriage as an end goal. He, again, is a little bit like, he finally addresses toward the end of the book the possibility, the likelihood actually, that single women should be working or are going to probably be working. But he says that this is basically, like, it's very clear that he thinks this is a silver medal at best. A woman's work, he says, should do even more for her than a man's work does. In fact, it should compensate her for the blessings that would have been hers had she married the right man and made a success of her marriage. All right, so I'm gonna bring it to an end here. I'll skip one just because I don't want to keep you guys too long here. What this shows us, right? Some of the advice manuals and pushback against marriage, right? Is that the 1950s are a uniquely difficult moment for single women, I believe. Actually, that's a very interesting question. Is it uniquely difficult for single men as well? I need to do more research before I can answer that. But I think it is a uniquely difficult moment for single women because there's so much emphasis on marriage. That's so much the norm that it's a tough time to not be fitting in. Okay. The 1960s, which we didn't talk a lot about, but they are recognized for a lot of radical changes, as you probably know, in American society. But an underappreciated one might be that the decade marks the beginning of greater acceptance for single Americans, in particular single women. Emblematic of this might be Helen Gurley Brown. You probably heard of her. She was the longtime editor of Cosmopolitan, but she gets that gig largely largely due to this book she writes in 1962 called Sex and the Single Girl. As you can probably guess, this is directly the opposite of John Lawrence and his Reluctant Virgin. This is going to be a very different type of book, actually, that she writes. And so basically, Gurley Brown's sort of assertion is that women shouldn't hasten into marriage. In fact, that it does her a good job to spend a lot of time looking around to decide what the best type of man is and really set her sights high. Also very differently is she assumes that there is going to be sexual relationships prior to and outside of marriage. And that's, again, a difference from the 1950s where we don't see that sort of assumption. She says, theoretically, a nice single woman has no sex life. What nonsense. She has a better sex life than most of her married friends. She need never be bored with one man per lifetime. Right? So again, within a decade, we're starting to see really, really different visions of what it looks like to be a single woman in America. And it is, again, a little bit more of that expectation whiplash that we saw in the 1940s, just applied differently in the 1950s. All right, I could talk about this all day, but you do not have all day, and nobody wants that. So I will wrap that up. Does anyone have any questions? I would love to take one or two here. 3, I don't know. Yeah.
I'd be curious to know, if you've done this, if we mine down into types of women, if we look at women who are educated, women who live in rural areas and urban areas, women who, like, one of the differences that's very obvious today is, like, Nebraska's marriage age is very different than, like, New York or California.
Yes.
Do you see those differences in the 1950s too, or is it more kind of spread out equally across the board?
It is certainly a natural next step and one that I would like to hit on more. I mean, in addition to location or types of living situation, culturally, ethnically, like, what are expectations for marriage in those kind of things? Class is obviously going to have a lot to do with your ability to be a single woman or not be a single woman, right? Like, all of those things. And so moving forward, yes, I would love to kind of break down more. But to answer, no, I haven't done a lot of that kind of fine tuning yet. Yeah.
Have you combined cultural thinking with the law,
Hmm.
because it was 1974 before a woman could get her own credit card. So if you wanted to own property in 1950 as a woman, that probably wasn't possible.
Yeah,
You
yeah, it
couldn't
was
get a
a,
bank loan, you couldn't get a business loan. That all had to factor in, plus the birth control pill.
yeah. So much of what drives high marriage rates for women throughout history is not necessarily like love or romance. Like that's kind of the nice story, and it's not like it doesn't happen, but there's this real economic motivation as well that for a lot of history, women simply can't afford to not be married, right? Like they're not getting paid enough because of the wage gap that exists, because they don't have access to, you know, independent credit or bank loans and those kinds of things. It's just really, really hard to make it on your own for a lot of history. This is completely anachronistic, but if there's any Jane Austen fans in here, right? Few? Anyway, okay. So in Emma, right, the main character, Emma, she's determined that she's never going to marry. And she doesn't have to if she doesn't want to because she's rich. And the great line is, it's poverty only which makes celibacy contemptible, is how she phrases it. And yeah, I mean, that's a sense that like, yeah, money matters, and access to the things that allow you to live independently are just really not available for women until second wave feminism actually addresses a lot of those things in the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? Where you're, you know, you're able to do things like get a PhD or buy your own house, right? Like I'm very sensible studying these things of like, this has not been possible for a long time. And that is kind of, it's sad, but also makes me really grateful too for
Are you
those.
pointing that out to your students, that the way they're living has been a hard fought battle?
I do, and it blows their mind. They cannot believe, like, they're like, you know, having them guess with like, when does that happen? Or like, when is interracial marriage made legal in the entire country? They're like, what? I'm like, yep. It's very mind blowing for them because they don't realize how recent really a lot of these
Even the
things
right
are.
to vote.
Yeah.
People were put in jail and beaten for trying to get women the right to vote.
Yeah, I really, one of the reasons I do love teaching history is because seeing students kind of make those connections, and especially US history, like you're able to do that because I'm like, okay, like ask your grandma about this, right? Like she will remember, you know, such and such thing. And that just really, you can almost see the shift of like, oh my gosh, like when my grandma was little, and like that puts it within their lifetime in a way that, you know, they clearly thought it was far before anybody's living memory, basically, than to have that kind of connection to people they know that may have experienced these fights or life being really, really different.
Hi. So it's interesting to see this history through this popular culture that you presented, and really great examples. I was wondering, well, I saw you referenced Homeward Bound in one of your footnotes. So, so that historian argues, puts this in the context of the Cold War and the fear of communism, and how the 1950s really emphasizes an anti-communist heteronormative standard. So it's the white middle class married woman that is the patriotic anti-communist model to follow. So did you see, so you didn't mention communism and the fear of communism here, and the whole connection to heteronormativity and you know, the whole issue of homosexuality being connected to communism. So being single, whether, you know, spinster or bachelor, you could easily be linked to being communist or pink, right? So my question for you is, did you see any of those kinds of messages in the popular literature here that you're exploring?
That's a great question, and there's certainly a link. I mean, in general, the 1950s are not a great moment to stand out, like in any way. That's not. It's going to be kind of a risky thing to do because of that kind of overarching fear of the Cold War and of communism. I find that the references are not specifically like, you need to get married so you're not like those godless Russians, right? Like that's not quite how it's phrased typically. But the ways that communism is presented, particularly depictions of women by Americans, right? So kind of two steps there.
McCarthyism.
Yeah, right. Like this view of, in the USSR, women, they have to be independent. They're not protected. They don't get to stay home with their children. They have to go to work. They have to wear ugly clothes, right? Like kind of those sort of things that are all meant to sort of contrast American femininity, right? And so I think that's, part of what's at play with like the very, honestly, I love the 50s fashion. I'm not gonna knock it, but it's this almost throwback to 19th century with the focus on the waist and the very full skirt. Again, is meant to be a real contrast between the USSR and the United States, and that all kind of comes to a head too with buying things and creating this home life. The kitchen debate, right? Richard Nixon standing in a kitchen and like talking about why juicers are necessary, right? Amazing. But it's part and parcel of like this very specific vision of independently owned home, two parents, their children, all of these consumer goods. It fits very much into that larger Cold War narrative. So I definitely will need to keep, an eye out, but so far I have not noticed like specifically like, if you don't get married, the communists win, right? Like it's not quite that overt. But I do think that that's part of, one more contributing factor of why there's so much pressure and so much emphasis on this norm of domesticity.
It'll be interesting to see down the line how this all plays out with COVID, which dating in COVID and all of that sort of stuff. Holy cow. I feel for everybody who was at that point or is, or if I have two 20-something.
Super awesome. Let me just tell you. But,
Well, I have two 20-something daughters, it's like, how do you go out and date and all the things? So kind of shifts.
Yeah,
again.
COVID is going to be interesting fertile ground for all kinds of gender questions.
Yeah.
Women disproportionately having to leave the workforce as a result of loss of job, or just like there's these many things that need to be done, and women disproportionately do them. Those kinds of things. Dating. Again, it's a 2-week like little mini class we have that is Single in America, and it's a blast to teach. The last day we just do like, okay, like you guys ask questions and let's talk about things. And one of the things they want to talk about always are like dating apps and and how does that change this sort of thing? And is there still stigma about single women? Like, what do you guys think? Like, if you lived 60 years earlier, you would probably be engaged or married. Like statistically, that you have a high chance of that. And most of them are like, that's like, I'm nowhere near ready for that or thinking about that at this time. And so, thinking about those connections for them and, COVID and personal safety and their awareness and of, the dangers of dating and all these things. It's really eye-opening. It's pretty cool. But,
Thanks.
Other questions? All right. Well, thanks so much for coming, and have a wonderful day. Nobody blow away. I know that's like cliche to say, but actually don't. It's awful. So thank you so much for coming.